Hello, I am in the Yahoo Esports studio today, joined by Noah Whinston, who is the CEO of Immortals. How's it going, Noah?
It's going well.
So this is part one of our talk. We are going to be discussing League of Legends, CSGO, and Overwatch, and maybe in part one we can talk about League of Legends. So Noah, the split has just kind of ended. We are now in the playoffs, but unfortunately for the first time since Immortals' existence, we do not see the League of Legends team in playoffs. How are you coping with the situation?
Well, you say for the first time, like we've had many years of playoff success, but we're at a 66% success rate.
Right,
so
right.
It's something.
But when you come into everything, I mean, you and I have spoken briefly about this before at LCS. You came in, you had really great success, made it in playoffs both times. That's not always the case for a newer team. So, I mean, it is a bit of a departure from your early success.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think, as much as it would have been great to make playoffs this split, I think we're all pretty cognizant at Immortals of kind of where we were at as a team, which was there were some weeks of LCS or days of LCS where we were just on fire, right? We were taking close matches with TSM, we were beating Cloud9, and then other times we would look like the worst team in the league and lose to like TL and Envy in the same week. So I think for us, we saw a lot of where our skill ceiling was. We saw a lot of where our skill floor was. And it was that inconsistency that really got to us in the end. And while, of course, I'm disappointed about not making playoffs, doing really well in the spring regular season didn't really lead to a lot for us last year. So at least our philosophy when we're going forward from here is more long-term focused than it is, we didn't make playoffs, let's blow everything up and start again.
Yeah, and I mean, where do you think that inconsistency came from? Like, what was the difference, this year versus last?
I think last year we were pretty spoiled, honestly. We got a team together that just kind of synced and clicked from day one. And for me, I'd never run a professional esports team before, and so while I recognized that it was special, I didn't really recognize how special that was. Yeah. So I think for myself, it's been a really good learning experience, this split, to kind of understand, hey, you can get a bunch of really good players all together, and they can be respectful and civil and work together. But if you're still missing that kind of intangible team synergy, friendship piece of it, it's really hard to get the players to perform more than just 5 individuals. Yeah. And I think that's what was missing a lot from our spring. You
mentioned missing that kind of team synergy, friendly thing, like the CLG factor, the old Cloud9 factor, right? I mean, that's maybe not going to change over a break between spring and summer. Is there a possibility that we'll be seeing changes to Immortals?
I'm not going to rule anything out, right? I think when we're ready to announce something, we will. I think one thing that I can say for sure that you'll see is probably more investment into beyond just the core 5 players. We've already signed some substitute players that we plan on having on-site learning, improving, and I think in spring we've actually seen examples of those types of substitute players stepping up and really performing. The most obvious example I can think of is Stunt from P1, who did a great job after being called up from the substitute roster. So I think on our end, we're keeping all of our options open, as any good team should. But I think the thing that we feel was missing the most from spring was kind of top-down structure, right? Immortals staff, Immortals organization, creating the space for players to develop that synergy and develop those bonds, rather than kind of leave them to do it on their own accord. So I think the biggest changes you'll be seeing is kind of how we operate, rather than necessarily the content of the roster itself.
Sure. I mean, I'm kind of surprised to hear you say that, just because I felt like we've heard a lot about the Immortals infrastructure today. You guys have multiple coaches and managers, and I think have had sports psychology folks come in and out and talk to folks. How do you approach leveling up something that, in comparison to some of the other teams, already seems to be pretty established?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get caught in the fallacy that big infrastructure equals good infrastructure, right? Like, having a lot of coaches can be really important, but if you have a lot of coaches and you don't have the right philosophy behind them, or if you don't have the right organizational capacity, then having a lot of coaches doesn't help that much. And kind of the opposite way, right? Like, TSM's never had a huge coaching staff, but they've always performed really well, and their infrastructure has always functioned really well because they have this very clear and concise and cohesive structure.
I mean, or Andy just shows up in the third part of the...
That's a structure.
The final, yeah, to some extent, yes, I guess. But it is interesting to sort of see even... there's an argument to be made, right, that TSM hasn't always found that structure and that they've had to kind of rely on the owner stepping in kind of this unconventional way to save the day at some point in time, right?
I mean, I've told Andy this to his face before. If he wasn't a CEO, he'd be the best head coach in professional League of Legends in the West. Right? He'd be incredible. Yeah. It's unfortunate he's also good at other things. That means he's not just a coach.
Right.
But I think on our end, we still have a lot of confidence in the staff members that we have. We feel comfortable moving forward with them. It's just more about getting more on the same page and more aligned in terms of the specific goals, right? I think last split was a lot of very focused on in-game stuff, and in-game stuff is still really important, but I think we may have found that, at a certain point, trying to teach better strategy and trying to explain better what to do in-game just isn't going to have the impact we want it to have unless the out-of-game stuff gets solved too.
Yeah. Interestingly, I think this has been kind of quiet since the start of the year, but at the end of last year, we heard Riot say that they were going to be pursuing permanent partnerships, and I think everybody's kind of has the timeline of this being the year where stuff like that starts to activate. I guess that's the term that they're using instead of franchising, because for whatever reason they can't use franchising. But have you, how are you thinking about that process and the introduction of all this coming in, especially as you're making decisions this year and all that stuff? Does it allow you to make like a longer term bet knowing that the stuff is coming? Do you feel like you have to really get stuff going in the short term? I mean, just sort of what's going through your head as all this stuff is coming.
Sure. So I think that if anything, that type of timeline has led many teams to make much shorter term based decisions. I think you saw that maybe particularly from Team Liquid this split, but they're far from the only ones. I think on our end, we don't necessarily think that just being there is what makes us good partners for Riot. Right, whether this permanent partnership thing is happening or not, right, like outside of the context of that announcement that they made last year, when we think about how we want to function as an organization, we want to think about how we function as an organization in partnership with developers, in partnership with the community, in partnership with our players. And I don't think that the very kind of dramatic short-term moves are the right way to build an organization in the long term. I think if you look at the competitive success of TSM, that's been built on kind of years of gradual roster changes, building people up rather than blowing things up and starting over when something goes wrong.
Yeah.
So in my mind, if we ever want to get to a level of TSM or Cloud9 in terms of their incredible competitive consistency, we need to take a longer term focus. And frankly, like, I don't care whether that sets me up best in the next 6 months for whatever Riot's going to do.
Sure.
I care that that's like how you build the future of an organization. Because if I blow up the organization to try and get in under the wire of a permanent partnership, and then I'm in the permanent partnership, but I have nothing to build on, it barely matters that I'm even there.
Yeah. Well, other than I'm sure, presumably, that would increase the value of your company pretty tremendously overnight, right? Being locked into the right system.
I'm not here to do that, right? Like, creating value in a company and increasing the value in a company is a side effect of running a company well, right? Like, that's not the end goal, right? Like, the goal is to create something great as an esports organization, and then, that's probably worth some money.
Yeah.
But it's not like there's a one-for-one correlation behind things that are good for the valuation of a company also being the right moves to make in the long term.
What about outside of building a successful roster and successful team? Do you feel like there are other moves that you, and certainly we'll talk about Overwatch later, maybe in part 3 of this interview, but do you feel like with Overwatch on the horizon as a league, and again the permanent partnerships coming to League of Legends, do you feel like there are other moves within the company that you have to be making, or other development decisions you have to make in order to set yourself up for this?
Absolutely. I think that particularly like brand identity, brand character is something that's really overlooked in esports and traditional sports too. I think almost every team is actively bad at it. Esports teams don't really stand for much right now. And I'm including ourselves in this, right? I don't think we've done a very good job of it up until this point, but a lot of my focus is getting put there right now, because ultimately, if we're asking fans to not just support their favorite player or not just support their favorite roster, but to support Immortals as an organization through whatever incarnations of rosters and teams we have, like, we need to give people something to stand behind. And it can't just be, well, Pobelter wears our jersey, therefore you support us until Pobelter's not here anymore. It needs to be, like, you are aligned with our long-term vision of who we are, who we want our fans to be, how we want our teams to be, and how we want our industry to be.
Yeah. So it sounds like brand building and sort of creating this identity is really important for you right now.
Yeah.
Do you find, or do you believe that that is some place for you to focus that isn't sponsorship or immediate revenue generation? I ask because, obviously Immortals has not gone out and gathered like the mass amount of like, okay, we've got peripheral companies all over the place, and we've got, you guys don't have the giant list all over your jerseys of all these sponsors. And one reason I thought that might be the case is because if you are looking at, where esports is headed over the next couple of years with things like the permanent partnerships, perhaps it's better to take a long-term approach and sort of invest in developing identity and brand before trying to come in with that, immediate sponsorship money.
Well, I don't want to write off the value of those sponsors and those partners, right? And we'll have some pretty fun ones to announce in the near future. I think more so, and to kind of give you some insight into what goes on behind the scenes of the esports business, I think what we've seen in the last year is a pretty significant collapse of the sponsorship market, or at least team-based sponsorship market in North America. Whereas 2 years ago, you probably had 3 to 4 high-quality teams that were doing a good job of branding and content creation and team building that mattered at any given point. Now you have like all 10 LCS teams really dedicated to building good rosters and brand and content. You have a bunch of Counter-Strike teams. You have a bunch of Overwatch teams. And so suddenly there's just a lot more supply of teams that are able to deliver the things that sponsors want to see. And so I think there's kind of a rebalancing act going on with sponsors, with teams, about what the best form of a sponsor relationship looks like.
Yeah.
And so on our end, the same way that we kind of prioritize long-term growth with a roster, we prioritize partners that are really aligned with us in terms of, the value that we can deliver, in terms of the value that they can bring to us, in terms of like the philosophy behind content creation and engaging authentically with fan base. And so we're not, we didn't start an esports team to make tens of thousands of dollars off of peripheral sponsorships in year 2.
Yeah.
We started an esports team to build something a lot bigger than that. And absolutely, there are sponsors that are really helpful at getting to that later point, and I'm really excited to be working with some of them. But I'm not a huge fan of the kind of like NASCAR-style approach that happens with a lot of esports teams, where it's just like, let's take whatever we can get, slap as many logos on ourselves as we can, and call it a day. Because that doesn't deliver value to the team, doesn't deliver value to the sponsor, and it's just this short-term fix that makes a team look good for right now because they happen to have logos on their jersey, but doesn't actually create long-term value for any of the parties involved.
So it's interesting you mentioned this kind of collapse of team sponsorship, or at least like a reevaluation of it, as there's a lot more options for them in the market. Do you think that we are starting to see sponsors come in? I ask because everybody always says like, this is the big year, everybody's coming in, this is big year, this is big year. And certainly I hear certain sponsors poking around, and I see big brands start to show up at like these events or these conventions, and then I never really see them invest. On the other hand, we have seen investment increase dramatically in the space over the past couple of years, and certainly I've heard some pretty crazy stuff about team valuations going up and up. So when you see a situation like this where you have, from my perspective, not a great increase in revenue or sponsors coming in, and then you also see more and more investment and more spend in the space, how do you interpret all that situation?
There's certainly a lot of hype around esports, right? A lot of that investment is driven by hype. And I think that on the sponsor end, it's not a lack of interest in esports, right? I've talked to a lot of non-endemic sponsors, and I barely even need to explain what esports is anymore.
Right.
I think right now the much larger issue is just these companies try to approach esports as esports. And that's just as difficult as trying to approach sports as sports instead of tennis and basketball and football. So when a company tries to approach esports as just this like homogenous block of 18 to 34-year-old males, it's really difficult for them to find a point of entry into that, right? Do we work with ESL on Counter-Strike leagues? Do we work with Riot Games for League of Legends? Do we work with teams for League of Legends? Do we work with players for League of Legends? Do we work with like any of these myriad of games out there? Or do we work on the platform side with like a Twitch? And it's really difficult.
Or Yahoo Esports, an amazing media site.
Yeah, that should absolutely have tons of corporate sponsors.
Sure.
And I think it's really it's difficult for me when they ask me for advice on where they should put their money. It's difficult for me to kind of make that evaluation.
Yeah.
So I can't imagine how impossible it is for them to make that evaluation, given how much less context they have about the esports ecosystem.
So it sounds like you think there's just like a lack of understanding or a lack of strategy that is just sort of commonly accepted for each of these brands to figure out how to get in?
I think it's partially that, but I also think it's partially lack of consolidation of value. Like, I think if there were one place that was just like, hey, you want to invest in esports, this place is going to be able to find the best avenue for you to do that. Right? Like, that provides a really clear avenue for brands to put money in.
So are you speaking more of like an agency or something like that? Like
it could be an agency. It could be a team association. Certainly within PEA, that's one of the things that we've discussed, the Professional Esports Association, which is made up of a group of North American teams. I'm sure it's discussions that are going on at the league level for Riot Games and for ESL and for Blizzard. And I'm sure it's something that happens at the platform level at Twitch and other streaming sites when they talk about the way that they want to bring more brands and advertisers into the space. So everyone's trying to be that one-stop shop, and I don't think anyone's doing it good enough yet, but everyone's getting there.
Yeah.
But I'd also say that, like, I really reject this ideology from the community and from some team owners about, like, hey, all we have to do to make esports big is hold out and hold out and hold out, and eventually those big corporate non-endemic dollars are going to come in. And I think that's like a real dereliction of duty, because if we can't figure out as team owners how to monetize our own audience, I don't know how we expect other people to be able to do it.
Yeah.
Because whenever a team sells content or a team sells a sponsorship, all we're really doing is saying, hey, like, you pay us for permission to make money off of our audience. Like Geico, you pay us money, and then you get to access our audience and try and convince them to buy your thing. And at the very base level, if sponsorships are supposed to be able to sell product to fans, then teams should be able to do that too, right? Like, we should be able to create good enough products to better monetize our own fan bases. We should be able to collect better data to know more about our fan bases and target them with things that are relevant to them, that they are willing to pay money for because it adds value to their fan experience.
Yeah.
Like, the idea that, I think there's this common knowledge that, like, premium content doesn't work in esports, right? You can't ever charge for content ever, because people will just always want free content. And I agree, right? Like, pay-per-view events, I think that would kind of suck for people. But there's certainly a subset of people that really enjoy high-quality premium content, right? Above and beyond what even currently exists in esports. And that might want to pay for that, right? Maybe it's not 90% of the fan base, maybe it's not 10% of the fan base, but if 10,000 people out of the millions that watch LCS want to pay for premium content, suddenly you're unlocking millions of dollars of revenue off of it.
So your point that, and we'll kind of loop this back to League of Legends maybe to close out this segment, but your point that if teams can't bring in these non-endemic dollars, or they're kind of struggling, it doesn't necessarily mean that a league is going to be able to, or any kind of broader entity. What does that say for the supposed permanent partnership situation that could happen as soon as next year with League of Legends? Certainly if the teams are having a hard time monetizing and creating all this, revenue, isn't that indicative by your philosophy that this League of Legends league will as well?
Well, no, I don't think that's really what I said. I think more what I said is that as a result of having so many different options, brands are struggling at every point, right? But that doesn't mean that inherently a league won't be able to, right? I'm sure that Riot, having LCS as a central consolidation point of value for sponsors makes it a lot easier to sell sponsorships, right? I'm sure that Blizzard's Overwatch League will be a really good way to sell sponsorships, because it's just like, sponsor the Overwatch League, you cover everything in Overwatch.
Yeah.
Done and dusted.
And then kind of just the final point on the League of Legends League. What is kind of your perception or hope for what this thing becomes? I ask only because it has been just sort of this amorphous idea, like permanent partnerships, franchising, there's no relegation, Riot will be able to sell all this stuff. There's a lot of different kind of ideas out there, but nobody really has, I've never seen anybody speak with what their expectations really are of it. And certainly perhaps you're under NDAs with Riot, I'm sure, that prevents you from maybe giving specifics, but I'm just kind of curious what your interpretation of this whole environment is going to be, again, as soon as next year.
For sure, yeah. So I'm not going to go into specifics about what that partnership model looks like.
Sure.
Less because I'm not allowed to talk about them, and more just because a lot of them are still TBD.
Yeah.
Right. But I think Riot's intention with it is really close to what I want to see out of it, right? Which is a structure that enables much longer term thinking and longer term cooperation. Like right now, and for the last 10, 15 years of esports, it's been very survival mentality, right? Like, if I don't sign this $100,000 a year sponsor, my team's going to disappear. So I need to give everything I have to making this sale. And $100,000 isn't a small amount of money, but in the long-term view of an organization, 5, 10 years down the road, who knows if that amount is going to make that much of a difference.
Right.
So in my mind, that permanent partnership model, it's not about, for me at least, like an ability to make my company worth a lot more. It's not an ability to sell sponsorships more easily that makes it special. What makes it special is that for one of the first times in the history of esports, a publisher is making a long-term bet on partnership with teams, right? They are saying that for the future of the competitive history of this game, like, you are going to be here. Right? We are going to be working with you. And that means that on our end as a team, we can invest a lot more resources into the long-term projects that just don't make sense to invest in right now. We can invest in developing talent that we would be worried, if we're talking about developing talent this year, who knows if you ever get to put that talent to use if you get relegated.
Right.
But if we're talking about long-term, you can develop content in the long term. You can develop talent in the long term. You can develop your fan base in the long term. And you can do these like longer event horizon things that are really, really difficult to justify putting resources into right now.
So do you think for you it's more about the stability that something like this offers less than like a revenue generation thing?
Yeah, and to be fair, I think those two are really linked, right? Like, having more stability leads to more revenue generation. Having more stability leads to like higher valuation.
Yeah, I asked because I worry sometimes that investors coming in think, oh, I just get in now, and then bam, like as long as I can make it into the league, suddenly just inherently the league is going to send me a bunch of money.
No,
right?
no, and that's some really flawed thinking. Like I've met a few team owners who, or even just like outside investors who think, oh, we're just gonna like make our selling point the fact that we could get into franchising for either Blizzard or Riot, right? And like, what they don't understand is that after franchising, like the work becomes more difficult, not less difficult, because everyone in that league is just as invested monetarily and otherwise as you are in making it work in the long term, and your competition is so much higher.
Yeah. Should the industry be concerned that perhaps between both League and Overwatch, there is a lot of potential money coming in and investment based underneath this false idea? And if that type of thing doesn't pan out immediately within the year or so after something like this launches, suddenly all those investors start freaking out and valuations.
I mean, yeah, if every investor invests with those expectations, then I would be worried about it, which is part of the reason I'm ringing the cowbell on interviews like this.
Sure.
But I think, like, anybody that's looking at franchising as a cash grab is looking at it in completely the wrong way.
Okay.
Right? Like, anybody that, whether it's an investor that thinks they're going to buy a slot and make a ton of money, whether it's a team owner that thinks, oh, they're going to get the slot and then sell it to somebody else, like, franchising is, and I say franchising, but again,
permanent partnerships,
whatever you want to call it. Like, if you get into that, what you're being given is not like privilege, right? What you're being given is an opportunity and a responsibility to grow yourself and grow your ecosystem from there. Yeah. And that's what I'm excited about. I'm excited for that opportunity. I'm not excited because franchising makes my company worth more.
Very good. Well, hey, this is the end of part 1 of the League of Legends section here with Noah Whinston. We'll be back in part 2 to talk about CSGO.